Hi, I'm Michelle and welcome back to Somewhere in Bookland. This is my February wrap-up. I've managed to read 10 books this month. Woo, go me. I managed to read 10 books this month, and so I just wanted to talk about them a little bit. Out of the 10 books I've read this month, I only own 2 physical copies. All the rest were read in ebook. Actually, the 2 physical copies that I own were read in ebook form, and then I later bought the physical copies. So I read all of these books on my phone or Kindle this month. So the first book I read this month was The Bow and the Bell by R.S. Gray. Now R.S. Gray is one of my favorite new adult authors. So whenever she puts out a new book, I have to read it. It doesn't matter what it's about, I have to read it. And I still have a couple of her older books that I'm trying to go through and read. But I've read 9 other books by her and I've loved them all. So as soon as she said she was putting out a new book, I knew I had to read it. So this book is about Lauren, who's a junior in high school, and her parents rent out kind of like a little studio apartment that they have in the back of their house. They live in a huge house in New Orleans. So they rent it out to this 24-year-old college student named Beau Fortier. I don't know if I'm saying Beau wrong. I don't know if it's Beau, but I'm pretty sure it's Beau. Like, you're my Beau. Beau? Beau in the bell? The Beau? I say Beau. I don't know if that's right. But they rent it out to Beau Fortier. And Lauren kind of gets this little crush on him. Now, she realizes that she's too young for him, and she still likes guys her age, but she gets a crush on him. And the story goes back from her perspective, back and forth between her perspective. The story goes back and forth between Lauren's perspective and Beau's perspective. So you see how he sees her and how she sees him. That's for about the first maybe half of the book. I don't even think it's half of the book. Maybe it's a third, the first third of the book. They're at this age. And then a hurricane hits. And they're separated. And she doesn't see him for the next 10 years. So flash forward 10 years, and they're both back in New Orleans, and their story continues. And I liked this book. This wasn't my favorite by her. I mean, I didn't mind the age gap. There was an age gap between them of about 7 years. I didn't mind the age gap. I liked when she was a teenager. I liked when she was older. It was just, there was something in the ending I was missing a little bit. I can't really say anything without giving anything away, but I wanted a little something more, maybe just another chapter. And since I didn't have that, I kind of knocked it down a star just because I felt like I needed a little more resolution on something. But other than that, I really enjoyed this book, and it took me about 3 hours and 25 minutes to read. The next book I read was by Christina Lauren. In January, I'd read Autobiography, which was my favorite book of the month, and it was the first time I had read a book by Christina Lauren. So I wanted to try another book. And so this month I read Dating You, Hating You by Christina Lauren. I kept hearing it was supposed to be kind of like The Hating Game, which I really enjoyed. And so I really wanted to see if I would like this book as well. This book is about Carter and Evie, who are agents at competing firms, and they meet each other at a mutual friend's Halloween costume party. They both happen to be dressed up as Harry Potter characters, which I find hilarious. They immediately feel this chemistry between them. They hit it off, and they start seeing each other a little bit. They're a little wary about it because they do know that they are working for competing firms and that they are both really dedicated to their jobs and kind of focus on it a lot. But then their 2 agencies merge and they begin competing for one spot, which is kind of, I admit, it's kind of like The Hating Game where they're competing for one spot. I gave this book about a 3.5, 4 stars. It was good, and I really enjoy the hate to love / enemies to lovers trope, but I think I was comparing it a little too much to The Hating Game, and I really enjoyed The Hating Game. And this one was kind of like a step below it. It wasn't as good as The Hating Game. And in my head, I kept thinking it and comparing it to this other book. So that probably wasn't fair to this book, but also this has nothing to do with the rating that I gave this book, but their boss sucks. And I like that it didn't gloss over the fact that Evie was getting treated different because she was a girl. I liked that Carter didn't necessarily ignore that fact either. He knew that she was getting treated differently because she was a girl. But yeah, I gave this a 3.5, 4 stars, and I read it in about 3 hours and 51 minutes. Now the next book that I read was Someone to Love by Melissa De La Cruz. This book is about this girl, Olivia Blakely, who's the daughter to a politician who's running for governor. And she's always kind of been in the public eye growing up, and she's really into art. I gave this book a 2.5, 3 stars. Not because it's bad. Olivia has bulimia, and she struggles with this need to be perfect. And this isn't a spoiler or anything. It says it in the little summary. I hadn't read the summary, so I didn't really know what it was about going into it. And I can tell you, like, if you have ever suffered from an eating disorder or anything, this book is probably going to be very triggering for you. This book got into my head with the whole thoughts of not being perfect enough. Like, she really talks about, she wrote in the writing, like, you see it, you're reading from Olivia's perspective, and you see all the thoughts that she has about how she's not perfect enough and how she messes everything up, and all these thoughts that she has about herself was like going through my head, because they're thoughts that I've had about myself before. They're thoughts that I still have about myself, about how I feel like I mess everything up, or I feel like I'm not perfect, and I feel like I'm not good enough. And so it was really hard to read this book and have to go through those thoughts where she's constantly thinking about what she's eating, she's constantly thinking about what she's doing, she's constantly thinking about how people are looking at her, thinking about her. And so it's really hard. It was really hard to read this book, I guess, which is why I rated it. Maybe if I had read it at a different time, it made me, after I read this book, I was just really sad. Like, it made me sad because it made all these thoughts that I already think, it kind of just magnified them. So it probably wasn't a good time for me to read this book, which is why I rated it how I rated it. It probably, if somebody else read this book, they could get, like, there was nothing stopping me from giving it like a 4 stars or whatever. It wasn't a bad book. It just put me in a bad place, which is why I rated this book 2.5, 3 stars. This book took me 3 hours and 48 minutes to get through. The next book I read was The Book Jumper by Mechtild Glacier. I'm sorry, I know I'm saying this wrong. Now, this book was originally written in a different language and was translated into English, which is just a cool little tidbit I thought I'd throw out there. This book is about this girl, Amy, who grew up with her mom, and they decide to take a trip to her mother's homeland in Scotland on this little island called Stormsay, and they go to live with her grandma just for a little bit, and her grandma requires that she read while she's there, and Amy's like, okay, I'll read, I like reading. But little does Amy know, her grandma doesn't mean reading like you and me read. She means reading like going into the book, because Amy is from a family of book jumpers that can jump into the book and like check on the characters and talk to them and stuff like that. There's another family also on the island that can do it also, and so they like take classes together, and then things start disappearing from the book. Someone is stealing stuff from the stories, and they're stealing like main plots of the stories, so something that would make the story like central, and without it the story starts falling apart. This book was very entertaining. The cover's gorgeous, And I wish I could jump into books and talk to the characters. Like, I didn't think I would enjoy this book as much as I did. I thought it would be kind of like an interesting read, but I enjoyed this book. I enjoyed how she got along. She like went on like a hunt in the stories and made friends with different characters, and it was just entertaining. It had like a mystery around it that you were trying to figure out meanwhile, and it was just a good book. I mean, I guessed part of it because it was a little predictable, but I didn't guess everything. I gave it 5 stars and it took me 2 hours and 51 minutes to read. The next book I read is like a new adult romance, and it's called Naughty But Nice. And it's a smutty book. It's a very, very smutty book. It's about a girl who falls for her best friend's dad. Let me just read you the first 2 sentences of the synopsis. He's my best friend's dad, and his package is the only thing I'm interested in this Christmas. Dear Santa, I've been a naughty, naughty girl. I kept reading this book, even though I wasn't enjoying it. I just couldn't stop. It was like a train wreck, and I just couldn't stop. This book's by Rye Hart. I forgot to say that. I gave this book a 1 star. I knew it was a smutty book, but I thought there was like a story, like a plot, and there wasn't. I mean, it has an average of 4 stars on GOODREADS, so like people read it for the smut. It just wasn't the smut I wanted at the time. I don't know. I gave it 2 stars. Yeah, took me 2 hours and 17 minutes. Next book. The next book I read was Ink and Lies by S.L. Jennings. This book is about Rise, who is an author, and he writes smutty romance under a woman's pen name. And so this book is about him and his best friend Fiona, and he's currently on a deadline trying to finish his newest book, and he's having problems, and he doesn't believe in romance. No, he doesn't believe in romance. So he's making all this up, and he goes and meets Fiona all the time, and she'll tell him some of her horror stories. Like, there's this one thing that happens that I busted up laughing on, but she tells him some of her horror stories, and sometimes he'll use them in his novels, or experiences that he's had with women he'll use in his novels, and it's funny. I really enjoyed this book. Obviously, like, it's a romance, so there's some romance in there. I really enjoyed this book. I gave it a 4 stars. It wasn't like the best book, but it was good. And obviously it's like a friends to lovers type romance, and it took me 2 hours and 57 minutes to read. The next book I read a lot of romance this month. The next book I read was From Lukov with Love by Mariana Zapata, and this was a 5-star book for me. It is a very, very, very slow burn romance. Very slow burn. About this girl, Jasmine Santos, and this guy, Ivan Lukov, and they're both ice skaters. Jasmine's getting older, and she feels like her figure skating career is coming to an end, and she recently lost her partner. And I don't mean like he died, I mean like he abandoned her. And she feels like that's it. You know, she's never been the number one, and she's always wanted to be, and she feels like she's a failure, and like she can do no right. And then her nemesis, Ivan Lukov, who's been number one in like everything, ends up coming up with this proposition that she skate with him for a year. And she's like, man, you know, like they're always at each other's throats. She's like, do I do it? It's the best chance I'll have. I cried so much during this book. I don't even know if you would consider this a romance. There's a romance in it. Like I said, it's very, 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 very slow burn. It doesn't really even get like romantic till like way near the end of the book. But this book's a lot about Jasmine growing up. Not growing up, but like coming into her own and finally feeling proud of herself. And she has all these problems with her dad, and she has all these like thoughts about herself. She thinks so badly about herself. And I cried during this book. And I loved it. So it's like the hate to love trope, slow burn romance. But really it's a book about her learning to love herself. And I loved this book. It was a 5-star read for me. It took me 6.5 hours though, which is like extremely. This is a 511 page book, ebook version. And I got it off of the Kindle Unlimited app. And it took a while to read. I have one little thought bubble that I put while I was reading it, and I said currently 55% of the way into this book and I am bawling. Jasmine is talking about how she's a loser and she sacrificed everything for nothing, and I am just bawling. And that was my little tidbit about that book. And so I loved it, 5 stars. The next book I read was The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. This was my favorite book of the month. I talk about it in my February favorites, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here in my wrap up. But this book is about Jude, who is 17 years old, and she was kidnapped from her parents. She was kidnapped by a fae when she was 7, and so she spent the last 10 years in the High Court of Fairy, growing up there as a human and being hated by most people. It is a 5-star read for me, favorite book of the month, and it took me 4 hours and 26 minutes to read it. And if you want to hear more about my thoughts, then I'll link my February favorites video somewhere down somewhere, and you can click that and I'll talk more about it there. The next book I read was The Boyfriend Bet by Chris Cannon. I read this book because it's by Entangled Teen Crush, which I enjoy, and I had read the first book, Blackmail Boyfriend, and I gave it about maybe a 3.5 stars, 4 stars. I like Entangled Crush because it's just completely cheesy YA romance for the most part. And sometimes that's what I'm in the mood for. The Boyfriend Bet is about Zoe and this guy Grant. And she kisses him because that's her brother's arch nemesis, and she knows that it would annoy him. And he was annoying her at the time, so she kisses him just to get back at her brother, and she feels a spark. And they end up starting to spend more time together. Now, Zoe's brother and Zoe, they are from the farming community in her town, and Grant is from the pharmaceutical or something community, science community in her town. So he's rich, she's not. It's from one of those opposite side of the track stories. So his family doesn't necessarily want them dating, and her brother obviously doesn't want them dating. And he tells Zoe that she's just a ringer, which is a tradition where one of the rich side dates one of the farmer side. They call them hicks in the book. So they date one of them until they hook up, and then they dump them. So he tells her, and basically the whole school is saying that she's just the ringer. But Grant's claiming that's not the case, but he isn't really any of the commitment type. And him and his friend did have kind of a bet going on. And it was okay. It was a decent book. I'm pretty sure this book was told in dual perspectives, both from Grant's point of view and from Zoe's point of view. And I don't know, it was good. It got a little bit redundant, like the same things kept happening over and over in it. I gave it a 3 stars, and it took me 2 hours and 15 minutes to read. And then I read Boomerang Boyfriend by Chris Cannon, which is the 3rd book in this Boyfriend Chronicles series, and I gave that one a 2 stars. It is Zoe's brother from the previous book. His name's Jack. So it's her brother and her best friend Delia, and they start working together, and then they start becoming friendly, and Delia's like, oh, Jack's not such a jerk, and they grew up together forever. So he was like, oh, she's not such my little sister, and it was just kind of boring. They didn't really have much of a chemistry, and Zoe was a lot more annoying in this book than she was in the previous book, like from the glimpses you did see of her. This book also was from dual perspectives, going from Jack's and Delia's perspective, but yeah, this one, it was like the first book, Black Male Boyfriend, and then they all just kind of, each book that came out, they kind of started slowly going down. So yeah, that's the 10 books I read this month. Like I said, most of them were romance. In March it's probably going to be romance and fantasy, a mixture, because I think I've already read 3 or 4 books in March, and it's about half and half right now. Those are all the books I read in the month of February. So click the like button if you liked this video. Click subscribe if you want to see more of this face in your feed, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye!